Morning and welcome to this new webinar of the Observatorio Culturale di Bioetica of the Faculty of Bioethics at Regina Apostolorum University. We are very pleased in this new year 2024 to wish you a nice, happy new year. Plenty of blessings for you, for your families, for your loved ones. And for our session of today, we have invited as a speaker, Sir Damien Marie Savino, Dean of the Science and Sustainability Aquinas, at the Aquinas College. And the topic that we will discuss deals with the climate change and the social-ecological resilience, nature and people in flux. I give the floor, first of all, to Father Michael Bagot, full-time professor at our faculty, and also interested and expert in the topic, that will moderate this session. And I thank you very much, both Sir Damien Marie and Father Michael, for presenting this very polarizing and challenging topic.
Thank you very much. And it's great to be here with an expert on such an important theme. We were talking about the fact that this issue of climate change, as many Catholics know, has been the subject of a letter from Pope Francis, which reflects his ongoing concern for this global challenge, this global difficulty. He returned to the theme that he already addressed in Laudato Si, his landmark encyclical, and that he's mentioned, discussed, talked about in many other contexts, really throughout his decade-long pontificate. And we also know, if we're following the news, that this is a theme of constant concern for global political leaders and other people around the world. So it's great to have Sister here, and many might be surprised when they see a religious sister to know that Sister Damien is very well trained in the topic, has a civil environmental engineering degree from the Catholic University of America, and has been very involved in the science and has been very involved in some of the practical implications and practical solutions to these issues. So I think it's quite rare to have both that engineering expertise and the philosophical, theological formation that normally comes along with being a religious sister. So we're very blessed to have her here. And just to begin, Sister, I wanted to ask, well, why is the Pope and the international community so concerned about this issue? Because sometimes you hear that, well, this is not so important, or data has been exaggerated, or we should focus on other concerns. Why is this something that the global leader of billions of people would choose to devote so much time and energy to?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for this time here with you. Well, I think any, bioethical questions and environmental questions, we have to approach soberly. And so we don't want to, be unduly alarmist or extreme. And I think we can trust that the Pope is not being unduly alarmist or extreme in relation to this. Now, in the process of doing science is a search for truth, but it's an iterative process. So, it builds on itself. So in any scientific field, and you could say this for evolution as well, you keep accumulating data and you make hypotheses and then accumulate more data. So it's an iterative process. And I think with climate change, we now have 30, 40 years, if not more, of data from many different fields that are converging to say, okay, the truth here is that there is a human component in this global climate change. People are aware, of course, that there are natural cycles of climate change over hundreds of thousands of years. But what we're experiencing since the end of the last ice age, about 11,700 years ago or so, is a change in temperature that is estimated to be about 10 times faster than the average rate. rate of ice age recovery. And we attribute this to carbon dioxide, and there's data, again, from many different scientific fields that point to this. And so we now know that carbon dioxide, which we are emitting from our human activities, is increasing about 250 times faster than it did from natural sources after the last ice age. And we have, so for example, paleoclimatic data to bolster that claim. So I think, and then we're seeing the effects of this in many different ecosystems and phenomena around the world. So I myself was very cautious when all the data first came out. And so I've gone through almost a personal process of trying as a scientist to review the data. And I just think it's kind of incontrovertible now. Like you just can't deny what's happening in the science.
Interesting. So you're basically emphasizing the fact that even though there are natural fluctuations that we can find throughout history, there's something very distinct about, for I guess lack of a better term, this post-industrial period, right? Like the changes that we see are far, far more dramatic at different levels since the Industrial Revolution and since the more widespread burning of fossil fuels, among other causes. So what are some of these concrete manifestations that really caught your attention? Like what made you start to say, okay, yeah, there's something serious here, and this is worth our concern?
Yeah, well, I think one was a very personal experience. I was with my family on a family trip in which we went down toward the tropics, and I noticed there were coral reefs there. And so we were experiencing many different natural phenomenon while we were there. And I was really excited to see the coral reefs. But when we got to the particular area where we went, they were just white. They were just, and it was just the coral. And then I realized, oh my gosh, I'm seeing coral bleaching. This is what I've been reading about. And basically it was like an underwater desert. And so that was kind of a personal experience for me, where it was the actual experience of seeing it was so jarring. And but then of course we have extreme weather events. So sometimes people say to me, well, it's colder than ever. Well, the extremes are what the manifestation is of global climate change. It's not extreme, it's extreme cold and extreme heat. So for example, right now I'm in Notre Dame now, and we are experiencing extremely cold temperatures because of global climate change. The Gulf Stream is actually weakening. So normally it would, the jet stream, sorry, normally the jet stream would hold the Arctic air masses in the north, but it's weakening. So now these polar air masses can go further down south. And so we are experiencing that. So that's an extreme cold, but that's a result of global climate change. We have sea level rise, which is affecting many island nations around the world, and that's a concern of many nations and of the Pope. The ocean is warming, and it's also acidifying, and that's one of the reasons that the coral are expelling their algae and becoming bleached. The overall global temperatures are rising, glaciers are retreating and melting. Another experience, I was presenting at Duke University to graduate students, and one of the graduate students is studying glaciers in Alaska, and he was asking me, how do I keep my hope as a Catholic when what I'm studying is showing that these glaciers are melting at a far faster rate than they've ever melted in geologic history? And it is associated with human activity, a human fingerprint. So I think all of those phenomenon are examples in ecosystems and locations around the world that are being affected by this global climate change.
That's very interesting. And I like the fact you start with that personal experience. And I mean, that resonates with me because I appreciate natural beauty. I appreciate the coral reefs. I mean, I've been blessed to do a little bit of scuba diving, a bit more of snorkeling, and so I really appreciate that beauty. And it's so disheartening to see that affected. But I also found it interesting that you move to a lot of other practical implications that go beyond what some people might dismiss as just a kind of aesthetic concern, right? Okay,
Oh,
well,
right.
some people are sensitive to the beauty of coral reefs or other aspects, and they don't want the environment to become more ugly, but really in the end, what's the big deal, right? But what you're getting at is the fact that these practical implications go well beyond having an uglier environment, which is already sad enough, right? This is starting to really disrupt people's lives, right? Because I think that's what sometimes confuses people, it seems, is they hear about climate change, they hear about these concerns, and they don't always immediately see the connection to ethics, to bioethics, right? They say, well, bioethics, it's dealing with human actions, it's dealing about good or bad actions that have some effects on other people. So in a sense, they might be tempted to think, well, where are the ethical concerns, right, about something that just seems to be more kind of aesthetic, right? So can you unpack for us even further, who is affected and how are people affected by some of these more extremes that we're starting to see?
Yeah. Okay, so a few examples that I had noted for sea level rise, for example. So the data shows that between 1901 and 1971, the average rate of sea level rise was 1.3 millimeters. It increased to 1.9 millimeters between 1971 and 2006. And then between 2006 and 2018 to 3.7 millimeters per year. Now,
That's
a millimeter, it is dramatic. So over doubled, right? So
right.
so that might not seem like a lot. Okay, so 10 millimeters in a centimeter kind of thing. However, when you are at sea level, so most of our population globally in our cities is around the coastlines. So look, New York, I mean, that's at sea level, right? And then you have many island nations, particularly in the Pacific, that are, of course, at sea level. And some of these island nations are actually going underwater, because of the sea level rise. So you're talking about many, many people affected by this. Then think of extremes such as heat waves or floods, droughts, tropical cyclones. They're all intensifying. And all of that, and fires is another one. So all of that not costs a lot of money, of course, but also has many human costs for those communities that are involved. And so the estimates, and this is taken from, so the IPCC synthesis report in 2023, so the most recent synthesis report, estimates that 3.3 to 3.6 billion people live in contexts that are highly vulnerable to climate change from the effects that I've just mentioned. So that's about 40% of the world's population.
Wow.
So it's no longer, of course, the poorest are always the first affected because they have the fewest lines of defense. So that in itself is a bioethical question. But now we're talking about, 40% of the global population. So it's going to be affecting many, many of us, and anything that has those kind of human impacts, and then associate with that food insecurity, water insecurity, all of those, all of those effects that make communities very vulnerable. And they're already vulnerable. So we're just kind of, accentuating and intensifying their vulnerability. And I think that's one big reason the Pope is speaking into this. He, of course, is concerned about the connections between natural and human ecology because everything is interconnected, as he wants to remind us all the time. So what's happening in the natural world is not just, a kind of extraneous effect. It's connected to human communities, and we are really seeing those connections now. So I think for that reason, it is a serious concern, bioethical concern. So
Yeah, no, that's very illuminating and very challenging to all of
yeah,
us. to see, okay, what's the potential response here. I know in reading the Pope's letter, at least in a section or two, he becomes more particular, right, in the responsibility of the United States. You know, both of us are from the United States, so we probably are a bit
Yes.
attentive to that. Can you speak to maybe what, of course, the Pope doesn't elaborate on these comments in tremendous detail, but why do you think in a letter from the Holy Father he would want to call attention to a somewhat unique role of the United States? And maybe you can speak both, it kind of both sides of that, right? How might the United States be uniquely responsible for some of these problems? And then maybe on a more positive, hopeful side, how might we play a key role in responding to these problems?
Yes, yes, and thank you for the both and. I think that's important because, the messages are difficult and we kind of have to have the courage to be sort of painfully aware of what's happening in the world. I don't think, certainly as Christians, as Catholics, we can't run away from that. But we also need to have the theological virtue of hope. So, and now for the United States, it's well documented that we are, say, using more or causing more than our share of the problem, right? Because we're very heavy energy users. We're very blessed to have all the resources that we have and to have the standard of living that we have, generally as an average. We certainly have many poor as well that we need to be aware of. But because we are a very energy intensive society, we're using much more energy than equivalent communities, say in Africa, South America. So we have, because of that, more of a responsibility, right? Because we're generating more of the problem. And the global climate change problem is not something that stays over the countries who are using the energy, right? It's affecting the whole globe. And he's trying to get us to think about ourselves as part of a global civilization. So we have responsibility for our part in that. That's sort of undue, that we have a larger part proportionally. Now, what can we do? So here's where I think on a number of levels, because I know sometimes people say to me, well, what can I do? I mean, what is turning out a light going to do? We need the big companies to get on board here. And that's true. We need the large energy producers and generators to make substantial changes in their corporate policies. But we also, each one of us, and the Pope speaks about this in Laudato Si, that there's something of a personal change, an interior change, and that's what we would hope our ethics would help us with, is to make us into good people, which requires an interior development and interior spiritual development. So I would say to my students, for example, if you turn off your light and are very attentive to saving energy, even though you're just one person and the actual amount you're saving might seem small, if you're doing it, first of all, out of an act of love, which the Holy Father refers to in Laudato Si, that is a noble act, right? And you want your day to be filled with as many noble acts as you can, right? That's how we become ethical people. And the other thing is that it's a good act. So, and that good wave might go out, and your one good wave might encourage another good wave and another good wave. And one person can make a difference if those little good waves eventually become, a tidal wave. Now, will we see that in our lifetimes? I don't know. But I think it's what we want to encourage ourselves to do is to put out as many good waves of good acts as we can. And then what's happening is our interior selves are changing into better people by noble acts, that we're doing in every day. And so that virtuous life hopefully extends itself all in the physical results of our acts, but also in the way that affects the other people around us. So I do think as Christians, as Catholics, we need to witness to that kind of goodness in a way that's, sober-minded, aware of the science, and understanding the human implications of the science, and then making a choice to to do a good act, whether it's small or large, just trusting that that good act will have good effects in the persons around us, starting with those closest to us. And that could be, improving our family life, our community life, our life in the church, our parish life. And,
Yeah, that's very interesting, because I think on the one hand, what you and what the Pope and other Catholics are doing is sort of repurposing some pretty traditional ideas about
yeah,
good stewardship, right? Having responsibility over creation, taking an active role, right? We're not kind of strict conservationists. We don't think it's bad to touch anything. We have an active role in really, in a sense, tilling the soil, right? Bringing the best out of these natural resources, but that role is not one of absolute domination or total
yeah,
control, right? That there's an order, a purpose, a harmony, a kind of finality that's inbuilt to creation, whether that be the external environment or also human nature, with Pope Francis talks about taking up themes from Pope Benedict, this idea of an
yes,
ecology of man, a human ecology. Uh, and also I like the presentation here, because it's bringing us to kind of traditional asceticism, right? Self-denial at times, but it's a very outward looking one, right? It's not just about how disciplined can I be, how good and strong can I be. It's what can I do for the sake of others, right?
yes,
My gestures, my actions, sometimes delaying certain gratifications or taking more care and concern and attention to something, is not just a personal self-sacrifice, for my sake, but it's something that really does have this wider impact, right? That does start to affect my community, and then in some way, however big or small, uh, the global reality, the world.
yeah.
But yeah, I think that's very interesting and beautiful. In
Thank you.
your experience, especially working with students, are there certain areas where you see that they maybe need to grow? Thinking, for instance, if you're working perhaps more with Catholic students at Catholic institutions, like we often are at Regina Apostolorum, are there certain areas of maybe ongoing education that you think are especially important? Because, sometimes we might not fully realize what we're doing. We might not fully realize the damage that we could be potentially causing, or perhaps we don't really realize kind of our omissions, right? It might not be so much a sin of commission as a kind of sin of omission or a negligence, right? That there's certain aspects that maybe we're just not being attentive enough to, because we don't realize the full implications, or we don't realize how other people are affected.
Yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, I know. And so this year I'm on a sabbatical, and I've been blessed to get a fellowship at the McGrath Institute at the University of Notre Dame and at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies here. And I'm working on these kinds of questions because I'm looking at how we could educate for integral ecology, this kind of marriage of natural and human ecology. And I think one theme that's helpful, it comes from Pope Francis, his emphasis on educating head, heart, and hands.
Hmm.
And so one thing I find, for example, we do a course where I live in Michigan with our community. I'm a Franciscan Sister of the Eucharist, and we have 230 acres of land. We do a fall break course where it's for undergraduates. They come for the whole week and they live with us. And part of it is academic in relation to Laudato Si and other readings, Benedict XVI, John Paul II, even Joseph Pieper. So those kind of readings, but then we do a project outside. So, for example, building a rain garden, a small project. I think the hands education is important in addition to the head
Hmm.
education, because I think just being able to integrate, I guess, our embodiment as humans, because sometimes we are kind of in uh, a society that separates those, and sort of the technology has kind of impinged upon the embodied experience of many of our young people. And I think in the end, that can have the effect of kind of making persons feel indifferent or totally almost afraid of touching things in nature and sort of separate from nature because we're indoors a lot with our devices and everything. So I think getting them outside and actually observing nature, learning how to be attentive. A lot of what we talk about is some writings. Josef Pieper has some very good work on attentiveness, and how we look at the world around us. Many spiritual writers do. And then the heart, I think when your hands and your head are engaged, you get attached to a place. And that heart connection, I think, will be necessary for our young people so that it's not just, one more thing I have to worry about, but I actually love this particular place and I don't want anything to happen to it, so I like Pope Francis's conception of educating the head, hands, and heart. Maybe because I'm a Franciscan too, because the Franciscan approach is very applied, and we sisters do a lot of that. We grow a lot of our own food, and I find the students are extremely interested in that, and they're very excited. In the course, we actually put them in teams, and they have to cook dinner every night, and that becomes one of their favorite things. And we're cooking with meat that we have raised on our land and vegetables that we've grown, making bread, that kind of thing. So I think all of that helps. The hands work helps engage the head and the heart a little bit more so that it becomes more of an interior conviction in the person. So that would be one thought that I have. I think that could be
experience of our embodiment that must be just so powerful. And I think that is that's a tremendous and much needed approach, right? Especially, speaking as a fellow academic, we find ourselves behind screens, right now, or in so many other contexts, and that's important and valuable. But yeah, absolutely. I see this in my work as a professor, also as a spiritual director, this sense among young people and others of a disconnect from their natural environment, and then sometimes how healing and enriching it can be to really consciously highlight these experiences, certainly of face-to-face conversation, of sport, of dance, of music, and then also these experiences you describe of working in the fields, of cooking, and absolutely. I think that's an excellent point. So you've given us a lot of really great guidance for that's I think applicable to all of us, as something to one degree or another accessible to all of us. But we know that there are different roles in society, right? And certain people have greater responsibility in certain issues. So I think, for instance, of politicians who are constantly, faced with different proposals, different ideas about how best to face these challenges. You think of, well, really just any voter in a democratic society who is hearing from candidates about this, about decisions that ultimately come to affect, at the very least, everyone's pocketbook, right? What will be taxed? What projects will we invest in? Is this wise? Is this appropriate? Will this be successful? Is this just kind of virtue signaling, right? There are these kind of fears, anxieties, and so forth involved. So starting to make me focus in kind of on focus out, if you will, in the bigger picture, at a broader level, at a kind of political level, as a society. Do you have some advice or proposals or areas that you think we really need to take into consideration, right? You gave us a very concrete example of the rising sea level, of melting glaciers, of extreme weather, right? What are some of the other kind of concrete issues that we need to consider as a society, right? That goes beyond what we're able to do as a virtuous person or as a virtuous small community?
Yeah. So again, little caution here because I'm not a political scientist. But I do, well, I mean, the biggie with climate change, I think we need to seriously look at transitioning away from fossil fuels. We know that those are having an impact. Now, how to do that in a way that's reasonable. So we may have to, and I think COP28 might have in the final documents refer to this. We may have to run sort of parallel systems for a while, which could be rather complex. But I think the goal needs to be to transition away from fossil fuels. Now, and so we want to get to be net zero, but so I think that's one thing. The other thing would be to mobilize, and again, COP28 started with this. I think one of the kind of landmark positive that came out of COP28 was the Loss and Damage Fund that was created now. And I think there's something like, I hope I'm not incorrect on this, but around $700 million that was pledged. Very small in relation to the like $580 billion of damage that's estimated around the world. But still, I think that to me seems like a worthy endeavor, so that we are putting some efforts into saving or helping those communities who have no resources, who are affected by climate change events. And I think our social teachings would suggest that would be helpful. How we grow food, to me, seems to be another biggie, because I think food and water are going to be really crisis issues that are going to be intensifying. We already have food insecurity issues and water insecurity issues, and I think they're really going to intensify with climate change. So I would suggest, some major efforts into things like regenerative agriculture, helping local communities to grow the food that they can need to support that their communities, rather than an intensely international global food market. And persons and many, many different political organizations, the UN, many helping organizations can assist with that in terms of training the local communities and growing food in water management and water resource conservation as well. But then, my students will say, yeah, but I have to drive to school and I need to use my electronic devices. I would highlight a concern here in relation to AI, because in writing my book, one chapter is on the effects of technology and how we counter them. And I was shocked to read that AI is a huge consumer of fossil fuels at this point, because the amount of energy that's needed to run these computers is staggering. So I think we need to really put some cautions on the development of AI. I know many people from many different fields are highlighting that, but I would just like to sign in with a serious caution there. Not that all AI is bad, but to think about the environmental impacts of AI. Not too many people are talking about that, and to try to ameliorate those. One other point I would make, I think, is and there was an effort here at Notre Dame going on with this. I'm not sure where it is now, but to get the energy executives together, and I believe they met with Pope Francis. There was someone here at Notre Dame who sort of brokered that meeting. So, they're in a safe place, and have them together from the different companies talk about, okay, we've got a ton of resources in our companies. How can we be the pioneers of developing transitional fuels and moving away from fossil fuels? And if we work together, could it be a way that we could actually make this happen? Because these companies have a huge amount of power and resources. So I think to engage them in what's needed, even technologically, to get these other types of fuel and transitional systems up and running on a large scale might be another, I think would be a really worthy initiative to work on. Or to continue working on. I think that there have been some conversations there.
Yeah, that's fascinating, and I think it's also it's always important for us to recognize that while there are so many alarming facts and trends, we've seen as well, and you're starting to allude to this, some positive initiatives and efforts, including from those who are involved in the development of different forms of energy and resources. And it's interesting to see that in these past years, some renewable forms of energy, some alternatives to fossil fuels are starting to become much more affordable, right? And now they're
Yes.
starting to become more just economically attractive, which I think is going to be ultimately key, right? I mean, it'd be nice
Yes.
to think that everyone would just do it out of love for neighbor, but I think it can be a both end, and it needs to be a both end. Yes, let's promote love and charity and concern for others, but let's also make these energy alternatives as economically attractive as possible, so that companies really have the incentive to pour these ample resources that you alluded to into these developments. So I think that's been one of the sort of glimmers of hope, at least that I've seen in some of my reading lately.
Yeah. And they may be better. Again, and probably we need economists to speak into this as well, but it seems to me that to keep them local, if it's that we may need major systems, but maybe to keep them local would be a way of making them effective
Hmm.
and economically affordable. So I don't want to say more than I'm competent to say there, but I do think some of that might help with a more local application of some of these technologies. And so that you're providing, just like you're growing food for your community, you're providing energy for your community, and I think that could also be very good for the communities, for building community and for building a local kind of enthusiasm for the projects and perhaps support for some of this work. But
Yeah,
the other
that's a
thing,
good point.
no, I was just going to say the other thing is I think to enlist the help of the large corporations with this. I used to work early on in my career. I had a job with United Technologies, and with their corporate offices, they weren't working on climate change, but they were working on cleaning up their contamination issues from their industrial manufacturing plants. And they had gotten so many stiff fines and a lot of bad publicity from their issues. So they had said, okay, we're going to invest in this. Let's clean up our own messes, And so I was on one of the teams that was involved. And it was a wonderful experience and they have a lot of resources. So our budgets were very ample. And, we just went site by site, and they gave us the free rein to explore new technologies for cleaning up the groundwater and then to implement them. So I think that taught me that, well, wait a minute. If I'm I support environmental initiatives, I shouldn't necessarily be anti-corporation, because the corporations actually could help us if we enlist their help. And of course, they have to make a business out of it too. So it has to be a both and. But so I think they have great technical people that they can draw on too. So we want to use that technical expertise the best way we can.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point. So I know that you have done a lot of work and research and have spoken on this idea of a social ecological resilience theory. And so that's a bit of a mouthful, right? And
I
it
know.
might not be immediately evident what that means to all of our viewers and listeners. So can you explain that and why you think that's so important in facing these concerns of climate change or broader questions of ecology?
Yeah. Okay, so yeah, social ecological resilience. It is hard to say it 10 times fast, that's for sure. But believe it or not, there was actually a meeting at the Vatican on resilience that I think this past summer, either this summer or the summer before. So resilience is it's also in the secular literature, and that's where, when I did my doctoral work, that's where I originally found it. But I was kind of captivated by what was being found in the secular realm, and I could see so many applications if we would combine it even with our social teachings. So I've done a lot of work on that. So resilience is kind of what you would think of when you hear the word resilience, like the ability to bounce back after disturbances and to maintain your say the cycling, the regular flows of a system when it is hit by a serious disturbance. This came originally out of ecological theory, and it was a scientist who was interested in, say, the effects of disturbances like fire and floods on ecosystems. Because earlier in ecological theory, so in the first half of the 1900s, it was believed that our ecosystems kind of get to an equilibrium state. So a forest, a field is cleared, and then gradually some seedlings there, and then it grows into a forest, and then you get a climax forest, right? And that's sort of the end of the process. This particular scientist, his name, he recently died, but C.S. Holling is his name. He proposed, and I think it was back in the 60s, 1960s, he proposed, wait a minute, folks, this isn't actually a complete diagram of how ecosystems work, because he found that with particularly fires in forests, they actually rejuvenate the ecosystem. For example, there are certain seeds that will not sprout unless they're exposed to fire. And so, and it's the same then, it was later found in many other situations, but with floods, they bring beautiful soil from very rich soil and fertilize the soil in a place. So even though they seem to destroy everything in the moment, they actually enrich the ecosystem in the long term. And that's a truth of nature. So that was kind of a major sort of discovery in ecology. As C.S. Holling worked with this, he put it in terms of resilience, that these, what he called creative destruction events, and he took that term actually out of economics, and I can't remember the economist who developed that, but it was basically, as technology proceeds, so as we got computers, then typewriters became basically obsolete, right? So they were destroyed in order for the computers to come forth, and he called it creative destruction. Well, Holling borrowed that term and said that's exactly what happens in ecosystems. It seems like a destruction, but it's actually creative. Those elements are rejuvenating, and they're giving resilience to the system. Then Holling, as he worked with this, and he had now, there's an international group that's involved in social ecological resilience, and they've developed all kinds of principles. But basically, they realized, well, what's happening in nature is not separate from human ecology. So they came to this idea of integral ecology before really it was articulated in the Catholic social tradition. But basically, they said, maybe since human systems are connected to natural systems, maybe we can apply these principles of resilience to our social systems, or to our social ecological systems, as they're so interconnected, to help manage so that the human communities are not suffering so much in the face of ecological disturbances that occur. So now it's a whole field called social ecological resilience, and there's much research being done in it. It's a young field, but so, for example, one principle that they talk about is maintaining diversity and redundancy in systems. So it all goes back to kind of systems science as well. But so in ecosystems, one principle, we want diversity, right? So the more diversity we have in species, if one species goes extinct, the whole thing doesn't fall apart generally, unless it's a keystone species. So generally, the more diversity, the more resilience you have, right? So in human systems, we need to maintain diversity and redundancy. We tend to design both our engineering designs, but also our human systems right to spec, with no redundancy, with very little diversity in the systems. And resilience theory would suggest that systems with many different components, whether they're species or actors or sources of knowledge, are actually going to be more resilient in the face of disturbances. And we know that climate change is going to produce severe disturbances that are going to be ecological, but also social and personal, just that for a lot of stressors for human communities. So we want to build resilience in the systems, both the ecological and the human systems, so that they can cope with the disturbances that are going to come. So that would just be one other principle. There's also how you manage the connectivity in the systems. They generally, interconnectivity is good, but there can be overconnectivity. And that's what we saw, I think, with COVID. Our global systems are too connected, so one little virus could spread over the whole world, right? So, but you might say that some people are talking about that in relation to electrical systems, for example. So right now, say on the East Coast of the US, that is such a large electricity system. If one part of it goes down, the whole thing goes down, and I think it even goes up into Canada. So
Wow.
some people are saying, well, we should do, and that happened back in 2003. The whole part, East Coast into Canada, northeastern Canada, was down when one part of the system went down. So some are saying, well, maybe as we transition, we should also have more modular electrical systems rather than these huge corporate systems. So there's many different applications, and then there's a lot of work on feedbacks and what they call slow variables and fast variables, how to manage them. So it's a very kind of exciting new science that's combining ecology and social science together. So broadening participation by persons is another principle that they speak about. So we have to kind of get away from the technocratic thinking into a little more like systems thinking of the whole system and the implications. So I guess adapting more of a systems framework and a resilience framework. So we build resilience in these communities so that when disturbances come, and many of them are going to be very unanticipated, and they might be uncontrollable too, but the system itself, hopefully we've built enough resilience in it that it can respond without falling apart.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And have you, so far in your research, seen any success stories of this kind of approach, whether consciously pursued or maybe even unconsciously? Have you seen communities that maybe have benefited from this model?
Well, I think so. Okay, so yes, I would say in the resilience network, this kind of secular network has a lot of ties to Sweden, and they've done some interesting things there where now it's always a work in process, so they call it adaptive management. So when an issue comes up for a community, and there it would be, say, related to water management and in the face of storms and such, they develop an adaptive framework in the human communities there, where they promote like polycentric governance. They promote a lot of local community involvement, and this adaptive management approach where so together they talk about something, they decide on a strategy, but it's not going to involve heavy engineering, but they will try this strategy out. They monitor it adaptively through each step of the installation of whatever systems they're doing. If it seems like it's building resilience, then they continue to go. If not, they alter what they're doing. So it's kind of you keep, it's like a winding river. You go one direction, then you might have to correct and go another. So it's not a lot of hard engineering where you put a structure in, a dam, and that's it. And then now another group that's doing something, they don't identify it as this, but I think it's very interesting, and along the lines, in my research, I'm going to kind of put it in the category of resilience, even though they themselves don't. There are some researchers in the Western US, I believe that they're at Utah State University, and water issues, so water shortage issues in the US, and there's a lot of proposals out there for huge multi-billion-dollar dams so that there's enough water for agriculture and human use. These researchers are actually looking at the capacity of beavers. So they're working more on I would say like an ecological resilience model, but it's having human implications. So and it's an interdisciplinary group that has engineers, biologists, social scientists, and actually ranchers now too. They have figured out how to encourage beavers to build dams. Basically, if a beaver hears the sound of running water, they're inspired to build a dam. So they've now perfected how they can get them to build dams in certain locations. What they found that was surprising, so the dams hold water in the surface, but what they found that they didn't realize would happen is that the dams actually raise the water table in the whole region. So that means the quality of forage in the ranch lands has improved, which the ranchers are really happy about because it's a better quality of forage for their animals. So by enhancing the resilience, and sometimes we don't know when we try, that's why it's an adaptive approach. We try something and they originally went in thinking, well, we just have to get more water. And could we use beavers to do this? It's a lot cheaper than doing, and then building a huge dam. Plus it's easier on the ecology. But then they discovered through that, in this kind of grammar of nature, that actually what happened was they're raising the water tables, and there are many positive effects on the landscapes there. So that's an example where the ecological resilience is I think driving a social ecological resilience. And I'm very supportive of what they're doing, because they've used technology, they've used geographic information systems to map every stream in Utah, and then to isolate which ones they think could be used for this approach. And they think they can scale it up. And I'd be fully behind it. I think it's an interesting approach, and think of just even the economic implications of that, and not to mention the ecological and the social implications.
No, that's a very interesting work being done, and it's great to see these different approaches, experiments, if you will, that have been successful so far. And I'm sure there's a lot of ingenuity behind developing new proposals and plans. We are coming, unfortunately, already near the end of our hour together. We do have a question, but before I field that question here, I just wanted to give you a moment, Sister Damien. You've been so kind with your time to share with us some of your work. How can we go deeper? Do you have some writings? I know you're pursuing right now this period of sabbatical study at the University of Notre Dame in the United States in Indiana, and I imagine that will bear fruit eventually in some publications. But are there other works that you've been able to put out that we can turn to learn more about this important topic?
Yeah, well, one reason why I'm doing the sabbatical is to get a book down, because as dean, I've had a lot of administrative responsibilities. So the book will have many of these thoughts that we've talked about in it. Otherwise, I mean, I've published articles, and if you go online, you can find some of those articles that relate. I've done a lot of speaking, and it seems nowadays that so many people put these on YouTube. So I think if, for example, some of this material I did present at the Kellogg Institute in November of 2023, and I believe that's up online there. I've also done some work at Duke University and Cornell University, and I believe those talks are up as well. And then also for the Society of Catholic Scientists, that if you, their annual meeting, well, I think it was 2022, I did do a talk on Laudato Si and introduced some of these ideas, and that talk is online at the Society of Catholic Scientists website. So.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, I hope all of our viewers have a chance to look for Sister Damien Marie Savino's work online, and we very much look forward to the book. We know what a labor of love it can be to bring a book forward, but I'm glad to hear you have it at least this year, maybe more at Notre Dame to devote some time and energy to that. I'm not sure if
sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
There's a video series put out by Salt and Light TV. It's a Canadian station. It's called Creation, and there are half-hour segments, and it could be, so that's something you can get for a very small price at Salt and Light TV. It's called Creation, and that lays out a lot of the principles in Laudato Si and Care for Creation. So, and that gives you case studies as well. Each segment is half an hour. There are some discussion questions and things if you wanted to do a group on that or use it in a course.
Well, that sounds like a great resource. Well, before we conclude this hour, which at least for me and I think for all of us has gone by very quickly, perhaps our dean, Dr. Alberto Garcia, would like to make an observation or a brief question. Or oh, I think the mic is muted.
Thank you. Only to
Yes.
say thank you, Sir Damien Marie, for this very enlightening presentation that has raised for me a lot of responses and also some questions, especially I'm very interested in the impact of climate change, especially in developing countries.
Yeah.
And some of the environmentalists today in developed countries, they focus on the protection of the forest, the water, and other topics that are important, but the worries of the people in developing countries when politicians are claiming they have to reduce emissions, etc., but they live in poor conditions and they have not received the benefits of the industrial revolution, of all the richness in developed countries, and how to balance this approach so that we can support especially people in poor countries and developing countries that are suffering more than me, of course, and the people in developed countries. So I think it's a challenge of the social teaching of the church to offer stimulus. And I love very much what you have been talking about, how to stimulate the virtue of people, not only politicians, but also the people, regular people. We can change our lifestyle a little bit, but the addition of a lot of little bit changes of life can do something significant. So thank
Yeah.
you very much, and thank you very much, Father Michael, for a very stimulating moderation of the conversation with the questions.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, sister, and we look forward to perhaps seeing you again in person. It was a delight meeting you at the University of Notre Dame at the last fall conference a few months ago, and hope to see you perhaps in September when I'm there again to speak at the Aquinas at 800 event, and feel very welcome here in Rome to come and visit us and to share your wisdom and expertise.
Yes, thank you. It's just been a delight being with you. So I look forward to future conversations.
Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you to our audience, and we'll see you for the next webinar next month.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.